bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking ideas and cutting-edge innovation. You're listening to Society and the State, Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome to the podcast. Brian Hyde here along with Connor Boyack. And I don't know if you were aware of this, but apparently there's been a Supreme Court nomination hearing that has been garnering some attention. Okay, sarcasm off.
You don't say. Tell me more.
Oh, my word. The word circus probably gets used a little too much, but I think it may actually be the most appropriate way to describe Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearing so far. I don't know if you saw the footage of the very first day, but people standing up and chanting and protesting and, allegations of past sexual misconduct now coming forward. And I'm just curious, Connor, give me your reaction. Have you ever really, been on the edge of your seat over a Supreme Court nomination?
No.
and why not?
Yes and no in the sense, in my past life when I was intensely more political, I clearly perceived substantial value and importance in these hearings. They're clearly important. They're definitely relevant. But what I guess I find interesting is, short of the presidential campaign itself, there is no other campaign in which the entire country is focused on one person. And even then, during a presidential campaign, you're focused on two or more people. And so the attention is spread across multiple people. You've got different people rooting for their guy in a presidential campaign. It's a little bit more diffused, but when you have a Supreme Court nomination, the entire country is laser focused on that one person. I think that's a very distinct thing that we're dealing with here in this process. The difference I've come to, I guess, Brian, and perhaps you'll agree with me here, is that I find far less relevance in the Supreme Court now, especially in my capacity, which I understand is different from a lot of our listeners, where, Supreme Courts will do X, Y, and Z, and yet I'll go to the state legislature and say, hey, go disregard what they said. Let's pass this state law. Oh, yeah, Supreme Court undermined Fourth Amendment. Good for them. Let's at least fix it here in Utah and for our purposes, improve it. And so for me, they have less relevance in my life, but it seems like this is the greatest political contest of modern America. And I guess I'll flip the question back to you, Brian, maybe both, in your previous life and today. Where do you stand on this? It seems like it's really hard to escape the effects of the circus. Even if we're not glued to the TV, you can't. I mean, to the point of your sarcastic question at the beginning, we're just bombarded with all the irrelevant little tidbits and rumors and everything related to what's happening.
I remember two other nominations that perhaps rivaled Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings. Clarence Thomas, back in the early 1990s, if you remember, he was accused of making inappropriate advances to Professor Anita Hill, who apparently was an intern of his at one time, and then Robert Bork, who apparently was a very respected jurist, but way too conservative for some of the politicos. And so now it's actually, I think you may be able to find it in the dictionary. He got borked. They stopped his nomination cold. So obviously, I've never really cared that much about the Supreme Court either, but I find it fascinating, the intense focus. And this is the contrarian in me coming out. Whenever the news media, or for that matter, whenever the political class is hyper-focused on something, my first reaction is always to ask, okay, what is this to distract me from? Because they pretend that it's the most important thing in the world. But as you pointed out, the Supreme Court was never intended to be the make or break institution that the Constitution called into existence. Our nation's fate was never supposed to hang on, who is nominated and who sits on that court or not.
I think it's instructive to note that when the Supreme Court decides something, when they issue their edict, if you will, I used to have a bad habit of calling it a ruling, right? A new ruling from the Supreme Court, and I think that's kind of a colloquial term that many journalists and others will use. They're actually opinions. It's a Supreme Court opinion. And I'm reminded of the story back when I believe Andrew Jackson was president. John Marshall was in the Supreme Court, and there was this contest over the Cherokees, and there was a lawsuit made its way up to the Supreme Court, and Georgia refused to obey the court. President Andrew Jackson at the time reportedly said, if I'm not mistakenly recalling this, he said, John Marshall, or rather the Supreme Court, has made their decision. Now let them enforce it. In other words, great, they've made an opinion. Good for them. But what are they going to do about it? How are they going to enforce it? I'm the executive, and I think there's a level of danger there where, if a Supreme Court existing as a co-equal third branch issuing their opinions and lacking the ability to enforce those opinions, and if the executive branch ignores them, it basically nullifies that third branch because they're at the goodwill and pleasure of the executive branch. So I don't know that that's kind of the perfect constitutional model to just say their opinions and nothing more, let them enforce them. But it does reflect, I think, this founding father era mentality. You look at Thomas Jefferson, right, talking about things like nullification and saying, well, good for them, but they were never intended to be the sole arbiter of what's constitutional. The states can and should step in and stand up for their rights if the Supreme Court is doing something backwards.
Which brings us to an interesting little tidbit of history. Who conducted judicial review prior to the Supreme Court assuming that power for itself in Marbury versus Madison?
I believe it was the state legislatures.
And the people. Yes, it was the states and the people. The same people who ratified the Constitution in the first place were the ones who ultimately determined if, hey, that's constitutional, or that jives with the Constitution, or it doesn't. And so when the Marbury versus Madison decision came along, you have a creation of the Constitution, the Supreme Court, asserting authority that, you know what, don't worry about it. We'll take care of this. We will rule on our creator, the Constitution, as to whether or not the other branches are following it.
I'm reminded, this is a brief tangent, but you'll see my point, Brian. When I see news stories of officer-involved shootings, and they show the picture of the law enforcement officer, and they've got their costume on, right? They're in full uniform, they've got their badge, they've got their gun. They clearly have the appearance and aura and mantle of one who is imbued with the power of the state, okay? And yet what I try and do, and it's hard because visual imagery being what it is, you have to really use your imagination. I try and look at that person's face and imagine them in plain clothes. Or if I'm out and about and I see a cop bullying someone around or whatever, I try and imagine this is just a dude. This is just a person or woman, who's bullying this guy around. He just has a fancy costume on and supposed authority to be doing this. At the end of the day, it's just a person, and we have to kind of demystify and deify, these beings that are among us. So too, I think, with the Supreme Court justices. At the end of the day, and I use this kind of pejoratively over the years, I call them black-robed lawyers. At the end of the day, these are lawyers, and lawyers disagree on things all the time. And we know lawyers are, like to twist words and are corrupt and have, not the best of intentions or whatever, right? Like, speaking generally about lawyers, I think the public kind of feels this distrust and dissatisfaction with the lawyer class, with the profession overall. Okay, does donning a black robe with little frilly things on it suddenly make them awesome and arbiters of justice and wise with no fallibility or personal bias? Like, no, these are just lawyers wearing a robe. And I think that's important to understand when we're talking about Kavanaugh. This guy's a lawyer. He's got opinions. He's got biases, and the left doesn't like him. At the end of the day, like, we're elevating these lawyers to the position of deciders of the fate of the entire American people. And I think it's that imbalance that reflects. In fact, we should talk about Senator Ben Sasse and that. Did you watch that video?
I have.
What were your thoughts when you maybe talk a little bit about that and share your thoughts?
Okay, so Nebraska Senator Ben Sasse, if you haven't seen the video, we'll link to it in the show notes for our episode. This is episode 115, Society and the State. He made a very important speech, possibly one of the best speeches I've heard come out of a politician's mouth early on in the Kavanaugh hearings. And what he described was, he said, the sensation that we have here of all these people protesting around the Supreme Court shows that there's a very decisive shift in public, I don't know if awareness is the right word, but our perception of where the power lies. The power center, according to how people protest, isn't the lawmaking body. It's not in the legislative branch. It's not even in the executive branch. But they look to the Supreme Court as the ones who will shape the destiny of this country, whether it's through judicial activism or otherwise. And he spells it out and says Congress has abdicated that responsibility and essentially handed it off And I thought his reasoning was very good when he explained the reason they do that is because once you are in Congress, it's more important to get reelected than it is to actually do the work that you were elected to do.
Yeah, that video I think was very illustrative of how far off kilter this entire system is. And watching it, and I hope our listeners, if you didn't see it, you'll watch it. I'm not one to tell people go listen to this politician and the wisdom that he's imparting, but he was on a tear, and he was absolutely right. You think of that old cartoon of like how a bill becomes a law, and like when you learn about the constitutional republic and the way the framers set it up, there's clearly a shift that has happened, and the fact that this is the greatest political contest of American history, rather than local races or state legislative races or congressional races, really shows how much power the Congress has basically punted, both to the administrative agencies, but then also to the court to interpret, the meaning of those regulations and the laws that Congress does or does not pass. And I think that's what's most unhealthy about this too, is that at the end of the day, it's kind of dereliction of duty that has led us to this point. And I don't know that we come back from that very easily. I think kind of we're condemned to a short-term future, at least, of these this political sparring over Supreme Court nominees, because we've allowed them, as Senator Sass said very well in this video, to basically be the deciders of all important political questions. Right? There's no debates in Congress. You talk to your senator, you talk to your representative, you watch them giving a speech in C-SPAN. You ask them, how many people were present when you were giving your speech? We like to think, as we're looking at them, that the room is full of their colleagues, this kind of founding father era or parliament in England where the stands are full and everyone's, engaged and listening. No, they're talking to cameras. They're talking to C-SPAN. And maybe some senators or representatives are in there mingling or talking in their own little conversation. It's all theater. And it's not like there's dialogue and debate and discussion. It's not like Congress is actually doing its work and answering hard questions. They are looking out for themselves. They want re-election. They want to flee from hard questions, and they want other people to deal with them. And when you kick that over, I think, Brian, this is what Senator Sass was talking about. When you kick that over to the Supreme Court, where they are insulated from political consequences, it becomes natural that Congress, who does have to face some level of accountability through elections, would prefer to, over time, shift more and more of that political responsibility over to folks who aren't accountable at all.
Let's talk for a moment about why having the Supreme Court be that ultimate arbiter of what is or isn't, the law of the land, is a bad idea. If you're not familiar with the concept of federalism, people hear that word and sometimes think, oh, well, it refers to the federal government and, its powers and how it's above the states. But it's actually kind of flipped that on its head. Federalism refers to the states being the origin of the federal government's power. So you have 50 little republics, essentially, and that means 50 little laboratories. They're not supposed to have perfectly uniform laws or policies. Some states are going to allow gambling. Some states, Nevada, I'm looking at you, would allow legalized prostitution. Not every state has to. But when the Supreme Court gets involved, when the federal judiciary becomes that final arbiter, what you end up is with one-size-fits-all answers to what may have started out as a more localized problem. Roe v. Wade is probably one of the biggest cases, which, it's been 45 years since that case was decided, and yet it's still a thorn in the side of many Americans because it hammered that one-size-fits-all approach for abortion onto all the states and held all the states to the same standard.
And I think there's a definite temptation in politics to handle things through one-size-fits-all solutions. Case in point, rather than working to allow people to have their property rights for short-term rentals on a city-by-city basis, rather than duking it out with each of these city councils, my preference is to go up to the state legislature and say, let's protect everybody's property rights. And, of course, when you're doing it one-size-fits-all, it's one thing to be focused on expanding rights. It's another thing to not. Any tool can be abused or used well, like a gun, for example. I think the challenge, though, is that when you've kind of conceded ground that there are these one-size-fits-all opportunities, then the apex of power, continually concentrates up to that apex, I should say, and you begin wrestling over, fewer and fewer people who are now in more and more control. And I think part of the challenge is the left has done this for so long, or statists have done this for so long, that those of us in the liberty camp I kind of feel, much to our discussion the other in a recent episode, Brian, about if our ballot initiative is a good or bad idea, and I come down on the side of let's use whatever tool we have at our disposal. If the statists are constantly concentrating that power, and if we can figure out a way to wrest that power a little bit in favor of freedom, let's do that. But the question is, how do we decentralize? And that, I think, is the tough. How do we pull that down from the apex? How do we make the Supreme Court less relevant? I think one way is to get state legislatures to basically give them the middle finger and go and pass contradicting laws that say, you guys did that, we're going to go handle things differently in our state. I think more of that, as we see in like the medical marijuana debate, as more and more states ignore federal law, that forces a rethinking. It changes the culture. That political game of chicken has consequences. I think if we start doing that with the Supreme Court, that would be healthy over the long term.
I would agree. And I would add one caution here, too. I know the partisan wrangling is, at an all-time high over the Supreme Court. And I heard a lot of people justify choices for who they voted for president. You have to hold your nose and vote for this person. Why? Because the Supreme Court is at stake, and this is, going to affect generations to come. There is no guarantee just because someone is nominated by a Republican president that they are going to, they're going to sit on that bench and operate with integrity. In fact, some of the worst justices on the bench, were nominated by Republican presidents. So it's a trade-off when people are willing to set aside their principles and vote for a particular candidate because we know they're going to support somebody on the Supreme Court who allegedly is going to uphold the Constitution. The shift is so decisive at this point away from the proper limits and roles for each of those three branches of the federal government. I don't think that is axiomatic anymore. I don't think you can count on that to happen.
One thing that I found, Brian, here as we wrap up, I want to make sure that I insert this final point. We give the Supreme Court far more relevance than it actually has. When you look at how many cases the Supreme Court is asked to rule on versus how many it actually does rule on, and then when you look at how many of the cases it rules on are over like technical weird things that matter only to the specific parties or a very narrow subset, these big substantial issues that impact all of society are extremely rare. And so we're giving all of this energy and all of this attention and all of this concern to a group of people who actually don't have that much relevance to our lives at all. Good heavens, if we found a way to shift people's attention, devote that same level or even a fraction of that energy and attention to areas of policy, areas of politics where they can actually affect change and where they can influence processes and people who do have much more relevance in their daily lives and are passing laws that they're feeling far more, that I think would be healthy. But good heavens, we are so focused on that area of government that matters the least and has the least relevance for us.
Hear, hear. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Society and the State. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe and recommend us to your friends. Again, this episode is societyandthestate.com/115. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.